Happy Friday, everyone.
TGIF.
TGIF. And you were just telling me that some people don't know that that stands for Thank God It's Friday. I'm
It's
super
Friday.
excited.
Yes.
Yeah. Also, welcome
I'm
back,
happy to
A.
be back.
Yeah.
I'm happy to be back. It's been a minute, but as always, pleasure being here with you, Rizel.
Yes. Pleasure being here with you too. I'm happy to have you back. Having Ebony on was great too. I'm excited to
Mm-hmm.
do like a little like rotation where it's like you and then Ebony, or maybe y'all even switch me out. I think it's a cool conversation. So for folks who are tuning in for the first time, if you're like, what is this? What are we doing? Basically, we talk to different experts within the SSI industry, that stands for self-sovereign identity,
Mm-hmm.
about like what work they're doing, because for me, this is like a learning journey, right? I wanted to learn more about digital identity outside of our company TBD, and I wanted to bring you all along with it. And also Ace did too. He was down to also do that learning journey as well. So today we are going to have Dan from Accenture talking to us about like digital travel credentials and much more. Hey Dan, how's it going?
Hello, glad to be here. Um,
Yes.
nice to meet you and whoever happens to be listening. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so thank you for having us too. I know that basically the way I reach out to people, they're probably like, "Who is this random person?" I like message y'all on LinkedIn or email, and they're like, "I heard you on a podcast or whatever. I read something that you did, and I'm really excited to have you on." So, thank you for agreeing to join us. So, usually to kind of like start the conversation, make things fun, I usually ask a couple of questions before we dive into everything. So my question to you guys and the audience is, do y'all think AI will take software engineers' jobs? Because recently, some company, I think Cognition Labs, they came out with Devin, the first AI engineer. And I thought this was a real human being. Like everyone was talking about him. I'm like, who is it? And it's just the AI engineer. So I'm curious, what do you all think about AI taking software engineering jobs?
I think it'll definitely change jobs. It will shift focus, of the software engineer or of the developers in general. I think the more mundane tasks will be, could be taken over, but I still think the creativity
Mhm.
will be in the hands of real folks.
I agree because I think definitely, like you said, it's gonna change the landscape a bit. Because it's a huge innovation, gonna change how we work, how we build stuff. But I don't think it will just take the jobs away, if you get what I mean. Probably make the experience of the jobs better or improved or just different. Not necessarily better as case may be, but definitely a change is coming.
I Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say I've seen this in other industries.
Hmm.
You know, I worked on a FBI contract for firearms identification, and where you have firearms examiners that are trained, and we worked on automating that, having computers be able to, where much like biometrics, you would image the evidence, crime scene evidence of bullets and cartridge cases, put it in this system where it would automatically bring what the algorithms thought were the best matches. And the firearms examiners were, this is going to take our jobs away. This is going to, and it took several years, but they were convinced that no, you could find to you. We're not going to. Nobody ever got rid of the firearms examiner. It just changed their role a bit. It took the more mundane, sifting through the haystack to get to the needle a bit better. But in court, for example, it was always the firearms examiner that would have to testify that
Right.
this evidence came from this firearm, or this evidence matched this other evidence, right? We
Right.
saw the same thing in travel, in border crossing, when we had introduced electronic gates, these automated border gates.
Hmm.
Some of the border guards thought, oh, they're gonna change me. I'm gonna lose my job because of this border gate. But it's not the case. The border guards, I don't know of any border guards that were dismissed, like that their jobs were taken away. Their roles changed, right? So they focus more on the unknowns than on the 99% of travelers who have no issues, right? So let the
Right.
gates, deal with those folks.
That makes a lot of sense. I already use ChatGPT to an extent like that for the common, routine stuff. Just do this for me. I don't need to go over it again. And then at the end of the day, I still have to, think through stuff and that makes sense. And I absolutely did not see AI sitting on the stand to give testimony. I don't see that yet.
Yeah, that would be nerve-wracking, I think. And thanks for those examples. I didn't even I'm so embedded in tech that I'm not thinking about these other industries and how technology affects them. I agree with both of you. I'm a big fan of using AI to code and stuff like that. And I don't think it will take away my jobs for the reason you said. We need that human at the forefront to actually get the stuff done. But it does kind of elevate the experience. I feel like AI has helped me at this company in particular because we're coming out with new SDKs and all of different programming languages, and we got to pick it up quickly. So I'm just leaning on ChatGPT or Copilot sometimes to be like, hey, how does Swift work? Help me out a little bit. All right, cool. So that was a good conversation, really fun. Okay, so just to let people know, if you just saw the starting soon banner, it said the old one. That was my mistake, but we're particularly talking about digital travel credentials, with Dan, and I titled this Cryptographically Verified to Fly. So Dan, will you please to introduce yourself and let everybody know who you are?
Sure. Dan Bachenheimer, let's see, as the background says, I'm with Accenture. I've been with Accenture almost 20 years.
Wow.
I'm kind of old school in that I've had 3 jobs since I graduated with an engineering degree many, many years ago. And each job was at least a decade. So I haven't been bouncing around a lot. But with Accenture, I've always been in the identity space. And that's border control related identity. But across all or most industries, whether it's education, finance, we call it Accenture Communications and high tech areas, but around identity. More recently, within the last 6-7 years, it became decentralized digital identity or self-sovereign identity, where we have the user in possession and control of cryptographically verifiable identity attributes. So that's, and I guess the other part of my background where I focus is in biometrics, and these which is an identity attribute that, like in a DTC, which we'll get to more, has biographic and biometric representations in it, each of which are cryptographically verifiable.
That is cool. I haven't stayed a decade at any company yet, so that is amazing to hear. But I'm really curious about, you did mention that joining Accenture, you've been there for 20 years. All along, you've been doing identity stuff. So I'm curious, from your perspective, how has identity changed in any capacity over these 20 years that you've worked at Accenture?
Right. So well, I'll focus in a couple areas. One area is that I mentioned biometrics, and what the last topic was discussion around AI. So biometrics were automated, let's say, by the FBI in the late 90s when they made the integrated automated fingerprint identification system, IAFIS. Biometrics had been used before that, but more on a manual basis. I'm old school again, so when I was fingerprinted for my background clearances, they take your fingerprints on cards, right, where they ink your fingers and do flats and rolls, right? So that has changed to now you rarely see ink on paper, fingerprints on FD 258 fingerprint cards. They're all live scanned. So the biometrics in identity has changed in that regard, and in the performance of biometric matching. How well does biometric matching work? And what we've seen, and what NIST has studied in the last few years, with the introduction of AI-based, in this case, facial recognition, the accuracy improvements have been um, uh, evolutionary. I'm sorry, revolutionary, not evolutionary, according to NIST. In other words, before AI, we saw an order of magnitude or of improvement in terms of accuracy. Since AI, it's especially again facial recognition, we've seen dramatic improvements. Tenfold. I mean, yeah. Improvements in terms of accuracy. So that's one area. This whole digital identity, we've seen a lot of advancements moving, let's say, away from physical cards. Even driver's licenses, right? We're moving to mobile driver's licenses, digital driver's licenses. We're seeing more digital identity constructs out there, in the world. Maybe less so in the U.S. than other regions, where the EU has legislated their digital identity wallet. And just last week, where they got final approval of the legislation from Parliament 2 weeks ago, February 29th. And last week, the EU had funded the development of a reference wallet, an open source reference digital wallet for European countries to use. That was released last week. So there's been a lot of advances in digital identity that way. But the biggest one, I think, is this decentralized digital identity, or SSI.
Wow. Okay. That was a lot of great information. Especially, I didn't even realize or think about the fact that like the ink fingerprints disappeared. Because I think I remember when I like came into America, we had to do that, but like I haven't seen one since. And that, so I have two follow-up questions from this. Hopefully, I don't forget them as I speak. My first is, this is more for the audience who's listening in. Could you explain what digital travel credentials are? And then I have a second part to this, where this is just my own personal like question. Do you think that eventually we will completely move away from like physical, like our society will move away from physical wallets and we'll just be like more relying on digital wallets as we move into mobile driver's license and mobile debit cards and stuff like that?
Right. Yeah, good question. So the digital travel credentials, specifically with capital D, capital T, capital C, comes from ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. So the ICAO was founded early last century by, it's a UN agency that's responsible for coordinating cross-border travel. The standards in that area, the security, and the governance of cross-border travel. So there's about I think it's 193 states, U.S. being one of them, that are part of that convention that agreed to be part of it. And one of the in 1995, so the first passport that came out was decades ago. The first they called it biometric passport. Now we call it e-passport. The first standard came out from ICAO in 1995. They called it a biometric passport because they added a biometric, a photo to it. It was required because ICAO said it's the best way to link the human with the travel document. In other words, before that, I could have had, Rizel's document or ACE's document, and went across the border. And if they weren't paying attention, I could have gone through it, or I could have manipulated it somehow, potentially. But now, when you cross the border and presented your passport to an e-gate or an officer, they check the presenter of the document to the photo that's in the document, that's cryptographically signed, and in the document. That I say in the document because there's really two general areas of our e-passports. The what they call surface personalized information, that's stuff printed on the document. They call it the VIZ, the visual inspection zone, and that has your photo printed on it, or surface personalized, and your first name, last name, date of birth, all that. And then a machine readable zone, an MRZ, down at the bottom that repeats a lot of that information. But they put it in a separate machine readable zone so that you could optically read that information. And then there's a chip within the passport that has a lot of the same information, but it's a smart chip in that it has a cryptographic engine, so that in order to access the chip, you have to do a very specific exchange based on ISO standards, and certain areas within the chip have more protection than others. So, for example, in order to get to the photo within the chip, there's what they call basic access control. You have to get information from the machine readable zone in order to handshake with the chip and say, what's this? Because the chip is going to say, what's the secret password? And you have to have been able to read the MRZ in order to answer that question. And why do they do that? So that somebody with an RF, a radio frequency reader, can't surreptitiously read your passport information without you knowing about it, because they first have to optically read that MRZ. Anyhow, so back to your question, what's a DTC? It's all the elements in the chip, but without a chip. So what's in the chip right now? There's what they call data group 1 and data group 2. So data group 1 are the elements like in the visual inspection zone: first name, last name, date of birth, country of issuance, expiration date, passport number, all those kind of things that are in this logical data structure, as they call it, and are cryptographically signed by the issuing country. Like in our case, it's cryptographically signed by Department of State, if in the US case. Then DG2, data group 2, is the photo. So you have a JPEG image, a standards-based image in data group 2 that is also cryptographically signed. Well, the whole logical data structure is cryptographically signed by the issuing country. And so in the DTC, it's not in a chip, it's in a file format. So a DTC is, according to the ICAO DTC spec for type 1 digital travel credentials, it's just a file, an ASN.1 file that has DG1 and DG2, text and photo that are cryptographically signed by the country signer, so that if I present that when I cross the border, the border agency can do basically two things: check the authenticity, was it cryptographically signed by someone I trust, and two, the integrity. Has the data been mucked with? Has it been manipulated? So a long way to say a DTC is the guts of an e-passport.
Yes. Okay, that makes sense. Sounds very similar to what we know for verifiable credentials. I forgot. I asked a long question. I forget the second part. So
so then the other part of the question was, do I think physical credentials and physical wallets will go away? I think it's going to be a while. I think we're going to get more and more used to having digital credentials in our smartphones, because A lot of us, especially in the first world, have heart palpitations if we're away from our smart devices for more than a few seconds, right? So we're going to see mass adoption of this this digital technology. But I think that for backup, for emergency use, I think we're going to have physical credentials. And the other aspect of the DTC, digital travel credential type 1, according to the ICAO spec, and which member states that will accept DTC type 1s will accept them per the spec that says, if I'm traveling on a digital travel credential, I must also carry with me the physical passport that I was issued. Again, as a backup, and some countries just want it as proof of possession. And some countries still do passport stamping. So if you traveled on a DTC to a country that has to do a passport stamp by law, well, you can't stamp a digital travel credential, which is one of the big differences from a W3C compliant verifiable credential. This digital travel credential is very cool, very secure. It's going to change things around a lot, but just like a passport, it comes from one issuer. You cannot change it. So in other words, you can't add stamps to it. It's not a wallet, so you can't have entry-exit. You can't add an e-visa to it. You can't update it. It's one and done, right? Whereas a digital wallet, you could have multiple verifiable credentials. You could have selective disclosure. There is no selective disclosure in DTCs. Why? Because they're purpose-built for cross-border travel. And why would, if me as a traveler, if I want to go to the UK, I can't selectively disclose the information that I want. The UK says, we agreed in this UN convention that you must provide DG1 and DG2. So no selectivity, traveler, in that case. Now, there's other cases for private sector, like in the video, the intro video, there was talk of presenting information to a hotel. Right now, because our passport books are the means of identification internationally, some countries require hotels to capture the information that's on a passport. I think once we have digital credentials, I think we'll be able to change that and only share with them the information that's required by law, and not the entire passport.
Thank you. That was really insightful. Also, that makes sense about the selective disclosure. Like in talking to you and the guest we had last week, I'm like, oh shoot, you can't use selective disclosure for everything, because the other guest, he was using credentials for the pharmaceutical industry and supply chain. And there's situations where you can't be like, yeah, I'm not gonna show all my information. Like you have to show it. But I'll also let Ace talk if he has any like follow-up questions or thoughts.
Yeah, my follow-up question is actually a bit random. Is kind of comparing the new DTCs to like the old passports that we've always had. The older passports, physical, all of those things. I was wondering, just especially for the sake of the audience, if you could shed a bit more light into how participating bodies would be able to confirm that the signer of these DTCs are actually legit. I would assume there's central registry, but I just wanted to have you shed more light into this, especially for the audience as well.
Yeah, no, another good question, and one that I didn't touch on. So part of that ecosystem that the UN agency ICAO is responsible for is the public key directory, the ICAO PKD. So that is the central registry where each member state, each of those 193, you have to participate in the public key directory. So out of the 193 member states, I believe there's just right around 100 that are issuing e-passports and participating in the public key directory. So they contribute those, and people can subscribe to that service, the public key directory. Some countries, like the UK, US, Germany, the EU is creating their own master list, which is basically that central registry, as you talked about, that they build based on the credentials that they see. And then the inverse of that, the other part of your question is that there must be a centralized list. There's also a centralized list of that Interpol deals with, the SLTD, the stolen or lost travel document. Because if you come across a passport, again, to your question, you want to check that it's valid against a central registry. But if someone reported it lost or stolen, the border agency, checks the public key directory or the master list. But they also should check, but don't always check, Interpol's stolen and lost travel document. I believe it was Malaysia 104, where there was two folks that boarded that plane that had the Malaysians check the SLTD, they would have seen that those two passports were stolen. So the central registries help for determining what's legit and what's not legit.
True. What was the story about the Malaysia? I don't think I have context on that. They were able to board the flight using passports that were stolen. What about the image? Because that's like a DG2, right? How did they go past the biometric validation of the passport?
Well, right. So it was a human validation. They didn't pay attention. They didn't pay enough attention.
Gotcha.
And to that point, NIST has shown that modern automated facial recognition is better at recognizing unfamiliar faces than humans. So humans in general are not good at recognizing unfamiliar faces. But the same study, when they showed like a really blurred photo of George W. Bush and of Obama, and they like only showed little bits and pieces of it, and they were kind of blurred, people were very accurate in their recognition. Oh yeah, that's Obama, or that's Bush. With little segments. Now a facial recognition algorithm wouldn't be able to do that. But humans, if they're familiar faces, just little tidbits of information will trigger us.
Cool. Thank you for shedding light on that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That reminds me of this game show. I never watched it, but I see commercials where people they show a celebrity, but only like maybe their eyebrows or whatever, or their mustache. And they're like, "Who's that?" And they're like, "Steve Harvey." But
Yeah. That would be the mustache. Yeah.
Yes. So I have another question. When I joined TBD, right? Like I wanted to, why I even did this, right? Because I wanted to learn more about this SSI industry and stuff like that. And I was really surprised to see that other companies there was a lot of known companies involved in this, like Microsoft or Auth0. And I was like, what? I worked at Microsoft. I didn't even know they were doing any of this. So my question to you is what is Accenture's motivation for getting into this digital identity and SSI space? Because I'm also going to be honest, I'm probably ignorant about what Accenture does. I know they're a consulting company. How did they get into this space? How many different things do they do? But yeah.
There was interesting when showing my age again. So when Jay Leno was hosting the Tonight Show ages ago, the Tiger Woods was in the news because he got into some issues, and sponsors were dropping him left and right. And then so the joke that Jay Leno said was, "Oh, and there's another sponsor that's dropping Tiger Woods, Accenture. Not sure what the heck they do, but Accenture is dropping." Well, Tiger Woods was our icon for a number of years back in the early 2000s. All the Accenture ads, had Tiger Woods be a pro, do this, but even back then, Leno was saying, "Who's Accenture?" Right? So we're the fourth largest employer in the world. with almost 750,000 employees. We
What?
do, yeah, yeah. uh, but like you, many people said, what's Accenture? What do you do? Anyhow, so the biggest at the highest level, management consulting and technology consulting, right? So how do we do process improvement? Management wise or business wise, how do we make a better process? Or on the management consulting side, on the technology consulting, what's the best tech to solve this problem, right? So on the technology consulting side is where a lot of this SSI lives. But there's some, as you can imagine, on the business side, right? How do we make a better process, right? Get rid of physical documents and all the process headaches around that. Paper documents for certifications is kind of onerous. Anyhow, so on the technology consulting side, a lot of system integration. We don't have product per se, so we might integrate Microsoft's Entra Verified ID, their SSI component, and we do that. We're very familiar with their tech. We are 90% stakeholder of Avanade, which is those are the Microsoft experts within Accenture. So as a system integrator, that's our role. So we want to understand the tech, be ahead of the 8 ball to understand who the best in the industry is, what do they offer, so that if we have a client that needs a specific solution set, we know, oh, these are the 5 vendors that we need to bring to the table to meet those needs. So that's basically what Accenture does. So like in the SSI world, you have wallet providers, maybe you have issuers separate from verifiers. Typically you have issuer verifier kind of together, but sometimes verifiers are very focused on verifying credentials, not issuing them, especially on the MDL side, right? You need readers separate from issuers, because issuer of MDLs are motor vehicle administrations, and readers might be a convenience store or a bar, right? Or TSA. So we do that kind of understanding the market, understanding the vendors, understanding how to put everything together and integrate it typically into an existing kind of outdated solution stack, right? So how do we modernize it without ripping and replacing everything typically?
Interesting. So maybe you're like maybe a state says like, yeah, we want to be able to accept mobile driver's license at the airport or whatever, and you help to integrate it that way. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, indeed, and understanding. So help them. So they might say, "Hey, Accenture, we heard about this new technology, MDLs. Come talk to us about our strategy of bringing that. What should and this is more the management consulting. What could that help us do? How much is it going to cost to do it? What are your recommendations?" So there's typically that kind of strategizing to begin with. And
That's a
then,
ton of expertise.
yeah. And then, you come out with a roadmap. Typically, how long is it going to take? What is it going to cost? Is typically what they, and the cost benefit analysis. So it's going to cost this much, take this amount of time, but this is going to be the benefit for you, right?
With that question, that leads me to that answer, that leads me to another question. And Ace, I'll let you talk too. I know I talk too much, but my other question is like, what are the benefits that exist of adopting like digital travel credentials, and then also what are maybe some cons to it?
Yeah, so the digital travel credentials, the primary benefit is security for the airport authorities, for the border guards, and for the traveler, typically convenience and speed. So the typical scenario with the digital travel credential is I want to fly from the U.S. to whatever I said UK before. So in the world of the future, I'd be able to share my digital travel credential to, well, I was going to say for exit to the U.S., but the U.S. already has that information. Customs and Border Protection already has our passport photo. Or if you're a foreign national that is leaving the U.S. to go back to the U.K., they already have your photo from when you entered. So we don't have to necessarily share it in the U.S. case, because CBP, Customs and Border Protection, has it and has it for 100 years, basically 99 years. But I also share it with the UK government. So before I even leave, from my couch typically, so they could start processing. Have we seen this person before? Do we have any reason to interview them upon arrival? Do I have any record? So that they could do all the security checks ahead of time. Now I show up, I'm leaving the U.S. Like I said, I could go through biometric exit where I don't have to take out my passport. In the future, I won't even have to take out my boarding pass. I'll have shared that in advance along with my DTC. Then the airline benefits from that, because they get fined if they if their manifest is not correct. So if I biometrically authenticate against cryptographically verifiable documents, their manifest is going to be that much more accurate. And so presumably they won't get fined. Then when I get to the UK government already has my information. They could just recognize me. They see this face, they bring up the record, and either that 99% of the time it's going to be keep on going because we have no reason to talk to you. But there's going to be the fraction of a percent that says, last time you were here, you overstayed your welcome, or you didn't pay duties, or you didn't pay a parking ticket in downtown London, and you got some splaining to do, right? So there's that. So, but again, to the traveler, I don't have to, when I arrive in London, hopefully it's just, I'm recognized and I keep on walking. I don't have to take out a boarding pass or a passport or even a visa, because a visa will be part of that electronic information.
That was really Nick said splaining. He really liked that. But I agree with Tanya that the ability to cut down like time travel would be like so amazing, because like I feel like I fly a lot for our job, right? Ace, you do too, right?
Yeah.
And it's well, at least for me, it's annoying, especially because I lose everything. Like I will put my like ID in my backpack and then I'll forget, and now I'm in line. I'm like, is it in my pocket? I don't know. And so like imagine I could just show up. I don't have to show up like a million hours early. They already got my information. I walk through, zip zap, done. But Ace, if you have any like follow-up thoughts or questions, feel free to go ahead.
Yeah, I've always wondered what it's like, sharing information across, destination and, what's it called, originating airports. So it's like putting more light into seeing how, making it more digitalized, cryptographically signed document information sharing. It's almost seamless, at least pretty much seamless, just being able to do that. And I'm looking forward to seeing that like in real time and just going stuff, because I mean, there are times where you get stopped and you're like, what did I do? Probably the fraction of the percentage of the time, like you said. So just having that entire process and you yourself, you feel comfortable. Even with the visas, there are times where you have like, for example, I got like a recent, what's it called? Visa approval, but the starting date for the visa is like a different period of time. But if I'm able to, initiate this process, like I'm booking a flight ahead of time, even if I miss that information, it's just confirmed ahead of time, like you're not eligible to fly yet, something like that, versus getting to the airport and then you get bounced and all this other information. So that's really exciting to see.
Yep. Yeah. And there's more and more e-visas that are being used today where, right, you go onto a government portal and you get that that status, as you said, the approved status or processing status. And typically what happens is Now the government sends that information to the airline. But what we could do with digital travel credentials is once you get that e-visa, well, that could be a verifiable credential that you put in your wallet. So when you go to book your ticket, you could share the verifiable credential with the airline, and then the airline again has certainty that you're that you've been approved to travel. And working with IATA, a private sector entity, the International Air Transport Association, they represent hundreds of airlines and airports. That's what they want. They don't want to handle our personal information on behalf of the government, right? But it's typically airlines that have to check: do you have the right visa? Do you have 6 months left on your passport? They just want to get a government, a verifiable credential from the government saying ready to fly, so that the government will determine: do you have enough time left on your passport? Do you require a visa? Are you on a watch list? Because again, the airlines today, when you have, especially in the U.S., when you get a boarding pass, it might have 4 S's encoded on it. That's TSA telling TSA that I'm a selectee. And why? Because the U.S. government doesn't have the right IT infrastructure in the airport for the TSA officer to bring up that I'm a selectee. In other words, I need extra inspection. The TSA has a pre-check program. Well, because they don't have proper IT in their lanes, they ask the airlines to print whether you're pre-check or not on the airline's boarding pass, so that the TSA could read that I'm a TSA pre-check enrollee. So there's a lot of things that governments put on the private sector that would be remediated by the use of verifiable credentials. Like, I'm a pre-check member.
Even trying to fly into the US, because I live in Europe, I have to, after booking my flight, I get like notifications from Delta, for example, that I have to upload my passport or my documents and visa and stuff like that. And all of that is just pictures. Like, there's no way to, I don't know how the process is in the background, but I'm assuming they have to do a manual check. And all of that load is on the airlines versus just, something that's already signed and you can process easily, like VCs.
Good point. I have a question, and it's specifically from Jeff Schwartz at Dentity. So he also has like a digital identity company. We've had him on in the past, and he left this question. He said, let me make sure I read it right. He said, with the proliferation of like digital identity solutions in the travel sector, the landscape has become like crowded, in his opinion. I personally, I don't even know about the landscape, but he said, can you provide insights into the various like competitive products and solutions available?
Yeah. So it's become crowded. I do agree with that, but some of that is going to be well. Okay. So your question is, what does that mean? So right now, there's different providers, different airlines, for example, are doing different pilots, and even DTC is like one of the main topics that you're bringing up. Finland just did a DTC pilot between Finland and Croatia. The Canadians and Dutch just did a DTC pilot between Canada and Netherlands. IATA did a pilot that used DTCs, but also W3C verifiable credentials between UK and Italy. So I think that might be what the caller was asking about, because they're all different. The standards are still evolving, and we saw this and we see this now. You could say I have a W3C compliant verifiable credential, but that doesn't give you interoperability, because there's different versions of that. There's different implementations of that. So I think that could be related to what what the caller was asking about. Even MDLs, mobile driver's licenses, right? There's ISO MD mobile driver's licenses, ISO standard based, and then there's some that came out before ISO standards. Like in the U.S., the American Administrator of Motor Vehicle Authorities, AMVA, has a map of the 50 states and what their status is. Some have none, some have ISO compliant, some have proprietary, like not ISO compliant. Australia has a similar case. New South Wales has an ISO compliant and Queensland doesn't, or I might have gotten that flipped around because one came out before the ISO standard came out, right? So some of the dearth of, or some of the some of the proliferation and differences are because they're not standards based, because the standards are still emerging.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I have one last question before we move to the fun questions. Ace, I want to give you a chance to ask questions, and I want to give the audience a chance too. So any thoughts y'all have?
If everything has been answered, thank you so much, Dan. So
Okay.
it's
Cool.
great.
The only other question I have, and this is question that I get often when I talk about verifiable credentials, at conferences. People ask what's the experience of working with regulators? What does that look like? I don't know because I don't work with regulators, but I'm curious, have you had to work with, I'm assuming maybe you've had to work with the government and different regulations and stuff like that. And what does that look like? Just a quick overview.
Yeah, so the ICAO, the advantage that ICAO has is that their standards basically have put into law. So when you travel, and that got put into U.S. law fairly recently, that since September 11th, that if I want to travel outside the U.S., I must have an ICAO approved passport. And DTCs are ICAO approved. So if the U.S. government wanted to allow their use, I can, as long as because ICAO says you must travel with the passport book. It meets that regulation. It's interesting, one of the most advanced digital countries in the world is Estonia. When they broke free of Soviet rule, one of the first things that they did was sign into law that digital signatures are legal instruments. Then several years later, they signed into law their national ID based on digital certificates. So they put it in the legislation. Right now, the other countries are getting there. Like I mentioned, EU, put into law the use of this, the EU digital identity wallet, and put into law some of the parameters around that. Like the wallet itself could be provided by the private sector, but must be certified based on the technical specifications that the government provides, right? Similar in Estonia, back to Ace's question about that central authority to prove it's legit. The digital signature law in Estonia said it must use the ID card must use these digital signatures based on the digital signature law, but because they wanted to break the government overreach of the Soviet Union, they said, well, that central repository is going to be private sector run. So that certification authority is within the domain of the private sector, but it must meet these strict government security standards. So only the private sector has access to the certification authority. The government does not, because every time you go to certify a verifiable credential, if you're a bad actor, if you were the Soviet Union, let's say, you could say that you could determine, oh, this person is authenticating at this bank, or this person's authenticating again at this bar, or this, so you could have that traceability. So Yeah, so there's a lot of legislation that should happen, and if it's done right, the government will provide the guardrails, and the private sector will provide the solutions.
I love that. Thank you. And thanks for sharing, like coming on and sharing your knowledge and your experience around digital identity. We will wrap up this stream again. I want to thank you for like your time and sharing your 20 years of experience in identity with us. I thought it was really like edifying. To me, the most interesting part about credentials is the travel part. Like once I heard about that, I was like, ooh. So I'm really excited that you took time to talk with us. Also, thanks Ace for co-hosting with me, and thanks to the audience for like your good questions. I think people were a little quiet, but people were tuned in. It says 270 people were tuned in, so people are listening. Thank you for tuning in and listening as well, y'all. And have a happy Friday. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.